Metroid friends, we finally made it. I waited over 18 years for Metroid Prime 4, more than half my life, but the wait is finally over for my most anticipated game. It feels surreal to even create this video. As soon as the credits rolled for Prime 3 back in 2007, I remember hoping for another entry in the series, and I distinctly remember the disappointment I felt when the divisive Metroid Other M was revealed, when the Wii U sales crumbled, and Prime 4 development was rebooted. Each of these failures created major challenges for Nintendo and the Metroid franchise, and hopelessly prolonged the wait for another Prime. Well, Metroid Prime 4 Beyond is finally here, and it surprised me in dramatic ways. I have so many thoughts on this game, it'll be difficult to compress them all into one video. I'm sure more content will follow over time. But let's dive in and analyze this experience. Moderate gameplay and design spoilers lie ahead, but no major story spoilers. I want to begin with just a general statement that overall, yes, I really enjoyed Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, and that's such a relief. If you follow my channel, you'll know I've expressed a mixture of hype and concern leading up to launch, mostly due to Nintendo's dicey marketing, but I went in cautiously optimistic. Beyond isn't quite the masterpiece fans dreamed of all these years, but after such a long and turbulent development life cycle, it's still a satisfying success. I now consider it as my third favorite in the Prime sub-series, though it doesn't quite reach the consistent polish and wonderful complexity of Prime 1 and 2. The game is artistically stunning but uneven in its design, caught between many moments of brilliance and frustration. Interestingly, many of the elements I expected to dislike ended up relatively inoffensive, while other more nuanced criticisms surfaced in unexpected places. For context, yes, I've beaten the game with 100% item collection and about 85% scan completion. I'm also well into my second playthrough on hard mode, and I'm enjoying it all over again. I wanted to really absorb this game for a few days before sharing my thoughts to avoid rushing to conclusions. When I initially started playing Beyond, the visuals immediately impressed me in real and memorable ways. Put simply, Prime 4 is an unbelievably gorgeous game for what is still a Switch 1 title at its core, though it's obviously amped up for Switch 2 with sharper textures and resolution. My earlier concerns about graphics vanished when I saw the game running in 4K at 60 FPS on a large TV. It's a dramatic improvement over the early previews and awkward trailers. I would even say it's the most technically beautiful game Nintendo has ever developed. Prime 4 also just feels much larger and grander than past games, and it's oozing with modern sci-fi style. The various rooms you navigate are on average much bigger than past Prime games. There are a far greater number of open vistas where you can see to the horizon, even outside of the desert area. More on that in a moment. The excellent visuals extend to the creatures, NPC characters, and essentially every shot of Samus. Prime 4's presentation is a major leap forward, not just compared to previous entries, but even among modern Nintendo titles. Both the 4K 60 FPS and 1080p 120 FPS modes look stunningly crisp and smooth. The game features well-rendered cutscenes with extensive voice acting, a sleek menu system, and multiple seamless control options, adding a modern coat of paint to its retro structure. From the moment you launch the game, the epic intro menu sets the tone perfectly, just like in past Prime games. The soundtrack also delivers, with those iconic alien sound effects woven throughout, and the strong choirs always chime in at the right moments. The real standout elements of the presentation are the different biomes you'll visit on your mission. Retro Studios has crafted top-tier environments that often recapture the visceral magic of the original trilogy. The Volt Forge and Ice Belt are personal favorites of mine, but almost every locale feels vibrant and interesting. They each effectively establish their own mood and rich atmosphere. One of the most distinctive features of Beyond's environments is how they transform as you progress. I really enjoyed this. Restoring power brings factories and machines back to life, while corridors and laboratories reveal hidden secrets and thaw from stasis. Scanning these different areas offers rewarding insights into the alien design choices and purpose behind each location. Beyond leans more heavily into stylized, futuristic sci-fi creations than most other Metroid games, which often focus on more ancient ruins with more subtle elements of technology or even entirely organic environments. Many classic Metroid elements return and are handled well. Thankfully, the scan visor is given strong emphasis and used in creative ways. The game strikes a great balance between new and familiar sound effects, like save stations, power-ups, and classic elevator ambience. Samus's suit and abilities still interact with the environment in interesting ways, including clever twists on classic powers, all without relying on gimmicky motion controls like we saw in Prime 3. The Morph Ball lasso quickly became a favorite new trick of mine, and I wish it was utilized even more. One nice touch that I appreciated are the Morph Ball transitions. They're much faster and smoother, letting you move freely in any direction while switching modes. Now, a recurrent theme you'll notice here is that Beyond is absolutely brimming with ideas around how to inject the old with the new, with widely varying degrees of success. One of my favorite aspects of this game is how the bones of it feel very retro or old school. The handcrafted appearance of the world, the lock-on combat mechanics, the slower traversal without a sprint option, the heavy first-person jumping, lack of bloated RPG mechanics, and the custom graphics engine. Beyond absolutely feels like the mid-2000s wrapped in a modern coat of paint and injected with experimental ideas as it tries to grow past older decades of design. In 2025, this formula and game structure often feels surprisingly refreshing and new again. For me, it felt like truly revisiting another time when games were made differently, but I'm curious to hear how this game feels to new players who never experienced the original trilogy or even this type of game design. Beyond also features many compelling boss fights, some of which ramp up the difficulty to a surprising extent compared to the core gameplay. A couple of these battles are some of my favorite in the entire series. I also appreciate the variety. Some bosses are towering giants with unique timing-based scenarios, while others are relentless and fast-paced brawls. Creature and enemy variety as a whole is fairly diverse and impressive, though I wish there were a few more returning staples from the series. Most power-ups in Prime 4 feature a psychic twist. Familiar abilities return with new uses thanks to these enhancements, and I found the psychic powers far more enjoyable than I expected. They introduce creative mechanics like spider ball tracks in midair, morph ball tethers, and a fun grapple lasso that's used in interesting ways, all of which make navigating these great environments a delight. I often wished for even more biomes to showcase and further use these abilities. The handcrafted level design lets these powers shine, unlike the procedural feel of many modern games, with the possible exception of the Soul Valley Desert. So Beyond introduces several new elements to the series, with Soul Valley and the Viola standing out as perhaps the most notable additions. Initially received with somewhat negative reactions, including my own, this desert area serves as a Hyrule Field-like hub, connecting biomes and expanding the world size far beyond previous Prime games. Overall, I found Soul Valley to be generally bland but inoffensive, and I even enjoyed some aspects as a detour from the core experience. The Viola vehicle handles well and is more fun to drive than I expected, so I wish there was more to do with it. For example, I wish some of the different biomes integrated the vehicle deeper into the experience. In past videos, I complained that the bike looks too much like a motorcycle and feels out of place. Over time though, I did sort of warm up to the design after seeing it integrated into different parts of the game. However, without going into any specific spoilers, there is another vehicle variant that's briefly in the game that I think looks significantly better, and I kind of wish that design or something similar was the default vehicle in place of the motorbike design. I wonder if the initial reception to the Viola would have been more positive overall with such a change. Now, Soul Valley features Breath of the Wild-inspired shrines with miniature puzzle challenges. Unfortunately, they're very few, only about 6, and could benefit from more complexity and quantity to make the valley feel less empty. I think even doubling the number of shrines to a dozen and making them slightly more involved would have gone a long way to improving this area. Ultimately, Soul Valley's potential is more compelling than its actual execution. It's a case of strong ideas hampered by mediocre implementation, likely due to Switch 1 hardware limitations and development constraints. If Metroid Prime 4 were a Switch 2 exclusive with more time, the desert could have featured richer visuals, more complex and numerous shrines, and seamless connections to other regions instead of awkward load screens. Multiple entrances and more natural integration would enhance the overall design While greater enemy variety in the desert and deeper vehicle combat systems could make traveling around far more engaging. Overall, though, I did warm up to the concept of Samus piloting a vehicle across expansive environments between more dungeon-style biomes. I would be fine with future games including some evolved version of this experience. However, the one aspect of Soul Valley that I strongly disliked was the green shard collecting. This mechanic feels extremely tedious and unnecessary. Simply removing it entirely with no replacement would improve the overall game. Beyond forces you to repeatedly drive into crystal mounds to gather shards and deposit them at the Great Tree, adding a monotonous grind mechanic to the exploration. The sheer volume of shards required is very excessive, and if you don't diligently collect throughout the entire game every time you're in the desert, you're left with a lengthy, dull grind near the end. The lack of music or engaging audio in the desert only amplifies the sense of emptiness or boredom when you spend a long time there. I strongly feel they should release a patch just to reduce the number of shards you have to collect by probably about 50%. It would improve the entire game and enable you to just passively reach the shard requirement as you go. The most annoying part of this shard collecting is knowing you'll have to repeat the entire process every time you replay the game, greatly damaging a staple of the series. I love replaying Metroid games, so this is going to be a major deterrent. One option here is to just keep a save file set right before the end of the game, allowing you to skip the crystals for the most part and enjoy the rest of the content, since you don't have to complete them until the very end. The other major addition in Prime 4 is the Federation Trooper companions. Now, I'm probably more open than many fans to limited cinematic story elements in Metroid, as long as immersion and isolation remain intact. For me, these NPCs are strangely comparable to Soul Valley, occasionally enjoyable or at least inoffensive, but often overstay their welcome and are ultimately a bit dull or underdeveloped. In retrospect, the controversy around Miles McKenzie was overblown. He doesn't ruin the experience, though including the worst 15 minutes of the game in the official press preview was a bizarre decision by Nintendo. Outside of those early scenes, Miles is only mildly annoying, occasionally offering basic guidance and briefly appearing in cinematics to alter your abilities. Most of his dialogue is underwhelming, but it's not as bad as the initial impression suggests. The other Federation soldiers are a mixed bag. Their dialogue and personalities are all a bit generic, but their voice acting is generally serviceable. To some extent, I think Prime 4 is intrinsically held to kind of a double standard here, simply because so many people don't want these characters in the game at all. There are endless RPGs, or first-person shooters, or even major games like Tears of the Kingdom out there with characters that are worse than these, but the backlash is more limited because there isn't this preconceived notion that they shouldn't be there in the first place. Like Soul Valley, the Federation Trooper companions show flashes of potential that could have truly been engaging with better execution. There are moments where the game tries to add depth to these characters, such as Tokabi sharing views on faith that hint at richer world building and more nuanced arcs. Unfortunately, these bits are overshadowed by overly cheesy or out-of-place elements, like Tokabi playing a harmonica, Duke discussing red velvet cake, or Armstrong's awkward fangirl moments around Samus, who just remains silent. These elements feel very cringe and out of place in a Metroid game, or really any sci-fi shooter, and it's strange that they weren't cut from the final release. Now, perhaps my most controversial opinion here is that if Retro continues to pursue this more cinematic, narrative-driven approach for future Prime games, Samus really should be given limited dialogue. While I've always appreciated her as a silent protagonist, the scope of cinematics here causes her complete silence to sometimes feel awkward. Even just a couple lines of dialogue per major scene would make these moments feel more natural. If Retro is intent on reducing the isolation and solitude of the series, I see little reason to keep her total silence intact. Now, looking beyond these characters, Prime 4 essentially has two narratives going at once in parallel. First, there's the story of the fall of the Lemorne and the great tragedy that happened on Vuros. This narrative represents more traditional Metroid storytelling, and I greatly enjoyed this aspect of the game. Discovering research logs or lore entries or holograms to unearth what happened to the planet is as rewarding as ever. And in traditional Metroid Prime format, the more you investigate, the deeper you understand the story rather than just essential events. I appreciated how Beyond introduced hologram cinematics to bring the Lemorne to life in a unique and more visual way, sort of like an expansion of what we saw in Prime 2 with the Luminoth temples, while relying on traditional scans to add detail and nuance. This is still a winning formula that Retro knows how to implement. The game's second narrative focuses on Samus's rivalry with Sylux and the need to cooperate with the Federation troopers to get home. This storyline is less engaging and somewhat disconnected from the richer Lemorne backstory and world building, despite some obviously intertwined elements. Without giving away spoilers, there are just noticeable gaps where events aren't fully explained or don't flow logically, as if scenes were cut or reserved for future games. And if you aren't familiar with Metroid Prime Hunters or the stories of the previous games, the Sylux thread is even more random. There are huge jumps between events without much explanation of how things arrived at that state. It's sort of hard to explain without spoilers. I'll save the deeper story for another video. Now, there's one more subtle but notable element of this game that might be controversial to longtime fans of the Prime series. And this is something new players will probably never even realize, which is kind of interesting to think about. Put simply, although they are aesthetically impressive and very enjoyable to just play through, the various biomes and beyond never reach the complexity or depth of design we see in the earlier Prime games, particularly 1 and 2. This certainly does not ruin the game, and depending on your tastes, might not even be a flaw, but it does create a different type of experience than some fans might hope for. You see, Metroid Prime 4 is a tightly guided, essentially linear experience, even within its impressive biomes, despite attempts to disguise this structure a bit. I rarely felt lost or unsure where to go, and the progression was straightforward enough that I even completed one biome without even really needing the map. This is a stark contrast to previous Metroid Prime games, which often required careful map analysis and exploration to build up your understanding of the environment to advance. Earlier entries in the series relied on two main puzzle-solving styles. For example, Prime 2 featured large, intricate dungeons with complex puzzles, while Prime 1 emphasized understanding the overall world structure and discovering keys to unlock new areas through exploration. On the surface, Prime 4 closely follows the blueprint of Prime 2, but in reality doesn't deliver that same depth. For example, the Volt Forge. This awesome level consists of 3 vertical towers you have to make your way through. However, the experience essentially boils down to trekking to the bottom of each tower and then back up again, with various small puzzles along the way. You don't really have to solve larger scale problems between or across the towers to any great depth. And most of the biomes are designed in this way. You sort of progress through them and then back out again. The puzzles scattered throughout the journey are enjoyable, but primarily limited to the scope of the room you're currently in. I really want to stress that these biomes are a lot of fun to explore and complete, but they are missing those deeper layers of that Metroid formula if that's what you're looking for. This approach differs from biomes like the Torvus Bog or Sanctuary Fortress in Prime 2, which required a deep understanding of the environment's layout, how chambers are connected, and a careful map analysis to progress. In those games, objectives often required actions in one room to affect another, creating intricate, interconnected puzzles. In Beyond, this level of puzzle depth is largely absent. I had hoped that since Prime 4 borrows from Prime 2's world structure, it would enable deep and interconnected puzzles. Unfortunately, that isn't the case, though more casual players might not even notice this or care. Strangely, this issue becomes more pronounced as the game progresses. Beyond's environments actually grow simpler and less complex over time, the opposite of what we saw in other titles. This might be due to development constraints or time pressure. As the game advances, it almost shifts towards being more of a corridor shooter or action game with puzzle elements, rather than an exploration-driven puzzle game with shooter elements. Still fun to play, but not always a traditional Prime experience. Now, due to its world structure, I also think Metroid Prime 4 would have greatly benefited from some form of limited fast travel. Vuros is much larger than previous entries, and moving in and out of biomes can be surprisingly time-consuming, often requiring multiple load screens or transitions in a row. For example, reaching the ice belt involves driving to the entrance area, loading through the building entrance, taking an elevator, and then a tram, and then of course repeating this process to exit. These transitions, likely due to Switch 1 hardware, become tedious during endgame backtracking for 100% completion. And as a result, what could be a 12-hour game stretches to 15 or more due to backtracking and the green crystal padding. I think a system comparable to Prime 2's late-game fast travel via the light suit would have been useful here. With this system, you can't just open the map and travel anywhere from anywhere. Instead, within each biome, you can go to a specific energy controller room to transport to the matching room in another biome. This middle ground makes you trek around the immediate environment without forcing you to keep walking back and forth across the entire world for no reason as you wrap up your final tasks. Prime 2 also connected some of those different biomes to each other using a secondary entrance so you don't always have to track across the main hub area. If you watch my channel, you'll know I think Prime 2 is an underappreciated masterpiece, but I digress. So ultimately, I think Metroid Prime 4 Beyond is a fascinating experience in terms of game design analysis and development lifecycle. Parts of this analysis might seem harsh, but I love overanalyzing Metroid games, and this entry is absolutely brimming with ideas and designs waiting to be assessed and experienced. For the most part, it manages to recapture many of the things that made the series great, even if it fails to reach the same consistently polished heights of the earliest entries. Beyond tries all kinds of new things, some of them work and some of them don't, but it still manages to retain enough of the core of what made the series great. It's still a worthy return to the series after all these years. Put differently, the highs of the experience greatly outweigh the low points. When you're navigating the immersive, deep chambers of the Vault Forge, or wondering in awe at the giant tree at the heart of Fury Green, it's very easy to forget and forgive various shortcomings. It's difficult to describe what a surreal, wonderful, and pseudo-emotional experience it was to step behind the visor once more 18 years later. Interestingly, I think buried within the different layers of Prime 4 is an absolutely perfect blueprint for Prime 5 or future 3D Metroid games with the proper adjustments, but we'll save that for another video. Hopefully more Metroid Prime awaits us in the future, but for now, I strongly encourage you to buy and enjoy the wonderful game we have here and now. Thanks for watching and supporting the channel on the road to Prime 4. Please hit those subscribe and like buttons and leave a comment below with your thoughts on this great game.